When I saw my husband standing on the porch, holding my phone in both hands, I knew instantly that something was wrong. He wasn't looking at me, he was staring at the screen, motionless, like time itself had stopped around him. My heart lurched, not out of fear of being caught, but because I had forgotten to delete that one message. That single message that wasn't meant for him. I stepped forward instinctively, trying to take the phone from his hands, but he took a step back, his eyes never leaving the screen. I watched as his brows drew together, his jaw tensed, and then I saw the moment recognition dawned. He was reading everything. Word by word, breath by breath, I saw the pain bloom across his face like cracks in a sheet of ice. I wanted to scream, to explain, to grab the phone and throw it into the bushes. But I didn't move. I stood still, paralyzed by a fear I couldn't name, because yes, now he knew something. But he didn't know everything. Not the late nights. Not the unspoken thoughts. Not how it even started. His fingers trembled as he scrolled, and I could hear his breathing pick up even from where I stood. And then it happened. A new notification popped up on the screen, my heart seized. I saw his face pale the moment he read the sender's name. He froze. Didn't blink. Didn't breathe. I bit the inside of my cheek, a reflex I hadn't done since childhood. My stomach twisted, because that name on the screen was the one I had prayed would never appear again. The one that made everything real. Everything irreversible. The man I never should have let into my world. I watched my husband's knuckles whiten around the phone, and for a moment, I didn't recognize either of us. And so, before everything unravels completely, before assumptions take over and silence poisons what's left, let me tell you the truth. The whole truth. Not just the betrayal, not just the kiss, not just the night, it started long before that. And if you've ever carried a secret so heavy it changed the way you breathe, I want to ask you, what would you have done in my place? Let me take you back to where it all began. It started with the sound of his suitcase wheels scraping across the wooden floor. He didn't say goodbye, not really. Just a quick peck on my cheek and a distracted "see you Friday," as he pulled the door closed behind him. I watched through the kitchen window as he tossed his luggage into the back of the car, already on the phone, already elsewhere. And just like that, I was alone again. The house was still. The kind of quiet that doesn't soothe, it itches. It presses against your chest like a slow, invisible weight. I washed our breakfast plates in silence, fingers mindlessly moving through soap and water. Outside, the breeze nudged the wind chimes, and I thought about the week ahead, about dinners for one, muted TV noise, and the empty space on his side of the bed. It wasn't that our marriage was broken. No fights. No scandals. Just a steady unraveling. Like a sweater thread tugged once too often, small at first, until suddenly, nothing holds. The porch creaked beneath my steps as I walked out into the late morning sun. I had noticed the loose planks 2 days ago. One had nearly tripped me when I brought in the groceries. I stared at it now, arms folded, toe nudging the splintered edge. I'd mentioned it to him last week. He nodded, said he'd take care of it. But like always, he didn't. I stood there, arms folded, then turned back into the house and opened the hallway closet. I found an old toolkit he hadn't touched in months. I didn't know what I was looking for, really. A hammer, maybe. Nails. Instructions for fixing the loneliness. The metal was cold in my hands. I carried it back out, sat on the porch step, and opened the case. Everything inside smelled of rust and time. I didn't know where to start, but I tried anyway, prying, pulling, tapping gently with the side of a wrench. The board didn't budge. That's when I heard the gravel crunch beneath slow footsteps. I turned. It was him, my husband's father. He lived only 2 streets down, had been widowed for over 5 years now. We saw him often, mostly on holidays. A quiet man, broad-shouldered and deliberate. He wore a gray flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up, and in his right hand was a single folded newspaper. "You look like you're planning war," he said, his voice soft but amused. I laughed, more than I meant to. "Trying to fix this stupid board before it eats my ankle again." He glanced at the loose plank, then at the tool in my hand. "Mind if I take a look?" I hesitated. But only for a second. "Be my guest." He crouched beside me, reaching for the board. His hands moved with an ease I hadn't expected. Efficient. Intentional. There was something almost tender about the way he tapped and pulled and lifted. I watched him closely, too closely. "Where's he off to this time?" he asked. "Chicago. Until Friday. Always traveling, that boy." There was no bitterness in his voice. Just observation. I nodded. "He works hard." "Hard work's a good thing," he replied. "But not if it costs you the people waiting at home." I didn't know what to say to that. We sat in silence as he removed the plank completely, then adjusted its placement. His forearms flexed under the fabric of his shirt. I caught myself staring and looked away quickly, cheeks warm. "You ever fix a porch before?" he asked, not looking at me. "No. But I thought I'd try." He smiled, barely. "Brave." We finished in under 20 minutes. He stood, dusted his hands off, and looked around. "You've kept this place nice. Clean. Quiet. Too quiet, sometimes." The words slipped out. I hadn't meant to say them. He turned to me, his eyes searching, but he didn't push. Just gave a small nod. "You need anything else?" he asked. "No. I'm good. Thank you." He lingered at the bottom of the steps for a moment, then turned and walked away, the newspaper still tucked beneath his arm. I stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the fixed board, but seeing something else entirely. That night, I opened my dresser drawer and found the silk camisole I hadn't worn in years. It still smelled faintly of lavender. I slipped it on, not for anyone, just for me. I looked at myself in the mirror and tried to find the woman I used to be. Not the wife. Not the mother. Just me. I lay in bed alone, listening to the wind tapping at the window, and wondered if he had noticed how I watched his hands. And whether he was thinking about it now too. The next morning began with the sharp clatter of a spoon hitting the kitchen floor. I hadn't meant to drop it, I wasn't even doing anything particularly stressful, but my hands were unsteady, and I was too distracted to notice how tightly I'd been gripping it. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, barefoot on the cold tile, just staring at the silver curve of metal as if it had something to say. I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the way he looked at me while we worked on the porch, the steadiness in his eyes, the subtle shift in his posture when our arms accidentally brushed. It wasn't overt. It wasn't wrong. But it wasn't innocent either. And what troubled me most was not his reaction, but mine. I tried to focus on errands. There was laundry to be folded, a grocery list half written, and dust collecting on the bookshelves. But everything I did felt mechanical, like moving through someone else's routine. My body was present, but my thoughts were lodged elsewhere, somewhere between curiosity and guilt. In the afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the hallway mirror again. Not deliberately. I had passed it on the way to put something in the laundry basket, and stopped. My reflection stared back with something almost unfamiliar. There was a softness in my features that hadn't been there in months, maybe years. I wasn't smiling, but I wasn't sad either. Just aware. I changed into something more fitted before leaving the house. Not tight. Just different. A dark blouse that curved gently around my waist, jeans that still felt a little stiff from infrequent use. I told myself it was for errands, that I just wanted to feel put together. But I also knew that after the store, I'd take the longer route back, past his street. The grocery store was uneventful. Fluorescent lights, quiet music, old couples shuffling slowly with their carts. I lingered longer than I needed to in the produce section, pretending to inspect apples while my thoughts drifted again. What would I even say if I saw him? Would it be awkward? Would it be the same? When I drove by his house, I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. But I did look. The blinds were open, and I thought I saw movement inside. I kept driving. Back home, I left the groceries in the car and sat on the front steps, my elbows resting on my knees, fingers playing absently with the edge of my shirt. The porch plank was still firm, the fix holding strong. I ran my toe over it, remembering the moment he pulled it loose, the quiet concentration on his face. I remembered the way his shirt clung to his back in the heat. I remembered too much. The sun began to drop, turning the yard golden. I went inside, pulled out the ingredients for dinner, then changed my mind. I didn't want to cook. I didn't want to be in the kitchen alone again. Instead, I opened a bottle of wine and poured myself a glass, letting the quiet of the house stretch. I was 2 sips in when I heard the knock. It was soft, almost hesitant. I didn't recognize it immediately. My first thought was that a neighbor needed something. I smoothed my blouse, tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, and opened the door. It was him. He stood there, not in work clothes this time, but in a clean, pressed shirt and dark slacks. Still simple. Still quiet. His eyes met mine and held there. "I was driving by," he said. "Saw your car. Thought I'd check if the porch held." It was a weak excuse, and we both knew it. But I stepped back anyway, letting the door open wider. "It's holding fine," I said. "Want to see?" He stepped inside. We didn't go straight to the porch. Instead, he stood just inside the doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the room like he hadn't been here in years. I motioned to the kitchen. "I was just having a glass. Want one?" He nodded once. I poured it slowly, measuring the silence between us. When I handed him the glass, our fingers brushed. I didn't pull back. Neither did he. We sat at the table, facing each other. The wine tasted sharper than I remembered. He said little, just sipped and looked, and I filled the gaps with questions that didn't need answers: how his day was, whether he was still reading that book he'd mentioned once, months ago. At one point, I laughed at something trivial, some joke about our lack of carpentry skills, and his face changed. The lines around his mouth softened, his eyes warmed. And before I could stop myself, I said, "You make it easy to forget the time." He looked at me for a long moment. "Do you want to forget?" The question was unexpected. Direct. And terrifying. I set my glass down. "I don't know what I want." Another silence. He stood then, slowly, like he wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do. Walked to the sliding door and looked out at the porch. I joined him, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the space behind us. The yard was dipped in early evening light. The flowers in the planter were beginning to close. Everything looked still. Safe. He turned toward me, not fully, but enough. And I did the same. For one long second, we didn't move. And then we did. We kissed. It was brief. It didn't linger. But it landed like a stone in water, rippling outward in waves that neither of us knew how to stop. When we pulled away, I didn't apologize. Neither did he. We didn't say anything at all. He left shortly after. Said he needed to feed his dog. I nodded. It was the easiest lie we could both accept. That night, I stood in the mirror again, staring at the line where my lips had pressed against his. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. The next few days unfolded with a quiet awkwardness that clung to everything I did. I moved through my routines as though they were foreign to me: laundry, emails, phone calls, cooking, but my mind wasn't in any of it. I felt detached from the life I had built over the years, as though I was observing someone else living it. The air in the house had changed. It wasn't just in my head. The silence felt heavier, thicker. Even the ticking of the old kitchen clock seemed more deliberate, as if time itself had slowed to process what had happened. We had kissed. It was a simple act, yet it had altered the shape of my thoughts, my days, my very sense of self. I avoided the porch. I avoided mirrors. And most of all, I avoided thinking about what it meant. My phone buzzed once on the third day after. It was a message from him. Still holding? It read. No punctuation, no flourish. Just 3 words. I didn't reply. But I did go out to the porch that afternoon, just to check. The plank looked the same. Firm. Steady. But I sat on the step and stared at it like it held answers I didn't know how to ask for. The sun filtered through the trees, throwing moving patterns on the wooden boards. I felt myself relax for the first time since that night, not because I had clarity, but because I allowed the confusion to settle without fighting it. Later that evening, I pulled an old box from the top shelf of the closet. Inside were photo albums we hadn't touched in years. I sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through pictures from vacations, birthdays, and ordinary weekends. Most of them were of my husband and me, smiling, posing, looking young and unaware of where life would eventually lead us. But the one that stopped me wasn't of us. It was a picture from a backyard barbecue years ago. His father was in the background, tending to the grill, unaware he was being photographed. There was something different in his expression, something open and unguarded. I hadn't noticed it before. But now, with everything changed, I couldn't look away. I closed the album, slid the box back, and sat in the dim light for a long time. The next morning, I received a call from my husband. He was in between meetings, as usual, and his tone was brisk but polite. He asked about the house, the bills, whether I'd remembered to confirm the dentist appointment he had scheduled. I answered everything, one by one. Efficient. Calm. He didn't ask how I was. And I didn't offer. After we hung up, I stood by the window and watched the wind move through the trees. I realized, with a strange detachment, that I hadn't missed him. I missed the version of him that used to sit beside me during thunderstorms, or kiss my forehead when I was pretending to be strong but felt overwhelmed. But that version had faded long ago, and now all that remained was a man who shared my roof when convenient, and my last name by default. That evening, I baked bread. The kitchen filled with the smell of rosemary and yeast, warm and grounding. I hadn't baked in months, maybe years. I wasn't sure why I had the impulse to do it now. Maybe I wanted to feel like I was capable of creating something whole again. Something that didn't involve questioning every step. The knock at the door came just as I was taking the loaf out of the oven. He stood there, holding a wooden toolbox. No whine. No excuses. Just him. I left this here, he said. I nodded and stepped aside. He didn't walk in right away. He waited until I moved toward the kitchen, then followed, careful, quiet. I placed the bread on the counter and turned to face him. You didn't have to come tonight, I said. I know. There was a pause. I wasn't sure if I'd be welcome. I didn't answer right away. The scent of the bread was thick in the air, and it grounded me just enough to say what I needed. "I'm not angry," I said. "But I am unsettled." He nodded slowly. "Me too." The toolbox remained untouched between us, a silent excuse. He glanced at it but made no move to pick it up. "I wasn't trying to start something," he said, almost to himself. "I know." We stood there in the quiet, surrounded by the warm smell of bread and the low hum of the refrigerator. "I thought I'd feel more guilty," I admitted, not meeting his eyes. "But mostly, I just feel confused." "I've been trying not to think about it," he said. "But that's not working." I finally looked at him. There were new lines in his face I hadn't noticed before. Or maybe they had always been there, and I had just never looked closely enough. "I don't know where this goes," I said, my voice softer than I meant. "I don't either," he replied. Another silence fell between us. Not cold. Not hostile. Just full. He moved toward the door. "I should go." I nodded. He picked up the toolbox, hesitated, then looked at me again. "Let me know if anything else needs fixing," he said. This time, I didn't answer. When the door closed behind him, I leaned back against the kitchen counter, arms folded across my chest. I stared at the empty space he'd just left, and for a moment, I wasn't sure whether I wanted him to come back or never show up again. I cut a piece of the bread, spread it with butter, and took a bite. It was warm and soft and imperfect. But it was mine. I had made it. And for tonight, that was enough. The day after he left with the toolbox, the house felt strangely bigger. As if his brief visit had stretched its walls outward, and now that he was gone, there was just too much space. I wandered through it without purpose, touching things I hadn't noticed in weeks. A framed photo near the stairwell. The dent in the hallway wall from when we moved in and the sofa scraped too wide. The old throw pillow on the guest room chair that still smelled faintly of lavender and dust. I found myself opening drawers I hadn't touched in years. One in particular, tucked away in the hallway cabinet, held a bundle of handwritten notes from my husband years ago, when he still wrote them. Small things, reminders to buy milk or pick up dry cleaning, but written with hearts at the end, or silly doodles meant to make me smile. I read through them slowly, feeling the ink press against my memory like a ghost. The most recent one was dated 6 years ago. It's strange how small things become monuments once they stop happening. That afternoon, I drove to the nursery on the edge of town. I didn't plan to go. I just kept driving until I found myself there. Rows of ceramic pots, dusty succulents, fragrant herbs lined up under a canopy. I hadn't planted anything in years. The garden behind our house was more a patch of grass than anything else, and yet, I wandered through the aisles, fingers grazing rosemary, thyme, little bundles of sage tied with string. There was something comforting in their earthiness, their unapologetic presence. They didn't need to explain themselves. They just were. I bought a tray of seedlings and a small trowel, then stopped by the hardware store to get gloves. On the way out, I saw him. He was exiting the back entrance with a bag of screws and a small folding step stool. He didn't see me at first. I almost ducked away, unsure if I was ready for another encounter. But then his eyes lifted and met mine, and neither of us turned away. He walked over with a quiet, measured pace, holding the bag loosely in one hand. "You garden now?" he asked, nodding toward the tray in my hands. "Not yet," I said. "Thought I might start." He looked at me for a second too long before answering. "It suits you." We didn't say anything else. He didn't ask to help, and I didn't offer. We just stood there, two people in a parking lot full of shovels and soil, holding the silence between us like something fragile. When I got home, I set the seedlings on the porch and just stared at them. For a long time, I didn't move. I didn't have a plan for where they'd go or how I'd care for them. But they sat there, waiting, ready. I worked on the garden the next day. Dug shallow trenches, placed the herbs in neat lines, watered them carefully. The sun was warm on my back, and the sweat clung to my hairline in a way that felt good. Like I was reclaiming something that had been asleep in me. In the evening, I sat on the steps with a glass of iced tea, watching the sky shift. Birds passed overhead in pairs, as if reminding me that life always comes in motion. I thought about calling my husband. I even opened the messaging app once, but I couldn't bring myself to write anything. What would I say? That I was fine? That I'd planted herbs and thought about kissing his father again? No. I couldn't. Not yet. That night, I dreamt I was walking barefoot through the garden in the dark. The ground was warm, the air thick with the smell of earth and mint. Someone was behind me, but I never turned to see who. I just kept walking. When I woke up, it was still early. Pale light filtered through the curtains. I sat up and reached for the glass of water on my nightstand. My hand trembled. It wasn't fear. It wasn't regret either. It was something harder to name, a quiet panic that nothing would ever feel simple again. Later that morning, I opened the fridge and realized I hadn't bought anything for dinner. The shelves were mostly empty, half a head of lettuce, an old jar of mustard, a lonely cucumber. I picked up my keys and headed to the farmer's market downtown. The sun was high already, but the crowds were light. I moved slowly through the rows of produce, letting the colors distract me, plump tomatoes, glossy eggplants, strawberries that smelled like July. I reached for a bunch of asparagus and felt another hand graze mine. I turned. It was him. We both froze. This was different from the hardware store. Here, among strangers and sunlight, there was nowhere to hide. You again, I said. He smiled faintly. Seems we shop at the same places. I nodded, unsure what else to do. Do you want coffee? He asked, after a beat. I hesitated. But then I nodded. We walked to the corner stand. He ordered 2 iced coffees. We didn't talk while we waited. He handed me mine without comment, and we walked a little down the street to a bench under a jacaranda tree. We sat there, the air warm and full of distant voices and the smell of pavement after a sprinkler run. I'm not trying to confuse you, he said, not looking at me. I just keep ending up in your orbit. I stirred my coffee with the plastic straw, watching the swirl of ice. I don't think you're the only one confused, I said. I wish I could tell you this is just a phase. A fluke. It's not. I looked at him then. Really looked. No. It's not, I said. Neither of us spoke for a while. The crowd moved around us in slow waves. A child passed with a red balloon. A woman laughed somewhere across the street. I need to figure this out, I finally said. Alone. He nodded. I understand. We stood together. The moment stretched between us. Then he walked away. I watched him go until he turned the corner. And I stood there for a long time, holding a half-empty coffee, knowing the taste would linger long after the cup was gone. The next morning began quietly. There was no urgency, no messages waiting, no plans scheduled. Just the familiar stillness of the house and the rustling of leaves outside the window. I sat at the kitchen table with a piece of toast and a lukewarm cup of tea, staring at the condensation gathering on the windowpane. The world outside looked peaceful, but inside, everything felt unsettled. I kept thinking about the bench under the jacaranda tree, about how he didn't try to convince me or press me. How he simply listened, understood, and walked away. That was what made it worse, in a way. That he respected the space I asked for. That he gave me exactly what I needed when I wasn't sure I deserved it. I cleaned the house slowly, deliberately, moving through each room as though I could scrub the confusion out of my thoughts. The vacuum cord tangled. A glass slipped from my hand and cracked on the edge of the sink. I swept the pieces into a dustpan, noticing how my hands trembled slightly. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Just fatigue. Just distraction. By noon, the house was spotless, and I felt no better. I decided to drive to the lake. It wasn't far, maybe 20 minutes, and I hadn't been in months. We used to go there in the early years of our marriage, before the trips, the meetings, the growing silence. I packed a book, a bottle of water, and a light sweater. The sky was gray, but I didn't mind. I welcomed the change in color. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled into the lot. Only 2 other cars were there. I parked near the edge, where the tall trees began. The air smelled like pine and wet earth. I took a deep breath and started down the trail that led to the water. It was quiet. Almost unnaturally so. Only the occasional chirp of birds and the soft thud of my shoes against the dirt. The further I walked, the more the world seemed to fall away behind me. I found the old bench where we used to sit, half covered in moss now, and brushed it clean with my sleeve. The lake was calm. A single boat floated far off near the center. I could just barely make out the figure of someone fishing. The breeze carried the faint scent of algae and wood. I opened my book but didn't read. I just held it, letting my thoughts move where they wanted to. I thought about my husband. About the version of him I had married. About how time had chipped away at who we were, not out of cruelty, but out of neglect. We stopped seeing each other. We stopped asking questions. We became practical, efficient. But in doing so, we lost the fragile threads that made it worth coming home at the end of the day. And then I thought about the man who saw me now. Who noticed when I laughed? Who asked how I felt and waited for a real answer? It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something. And it was dangerous. I stayed by the lake until the light began to change. The clouds moved in thicker, the air colder. I packed my things and started back toward the car, the weight of the coming evening settling over me like fog. When I returned home, the porch light blinked on as I approached. I climbed the steps slowly, still holding the quiet of the lake inside me. I unlocked the door, stepped in, and froze. There was a note on the hallway table. I knew the handwriting before I even picked it up. Bold, slanted, deliberate. Came by to return your pruning shears. Left them by the back gate. Hope the herbs are still doing well. M. No more. No less. I folded the note and placed it inside a drawer, but my fingers lingered over the edge. He hadn't knocked. Hadn't tried to see me. He'd just come, left what needed leaving, and gone. I stepped out the back door and walked to the gate. The shears were resting on the stone ledge, clean and sharpened. I picked them up, ran my fingers along the polished edge. I looked around, half expecting to see him still nearby, watching from a distance. But there was no one. Just the soft hum of crickets and the dimming sky. I stood there for a while, not moving. And then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I turned on music in the kitchen. Quiet, jazzy, something that didn't ask for attention. I made a simple dinner, grilled vegetables, couscous, a piece of warm flatbread. I poured myself a glass of wine and ate slowly, tasting everything. After dinner, I sat in the living room with a blanket over my legs and a notebook in my lap. I used to write. Nothing formal. Just thoughts. Feelings. Observations. But I had stopped years ago, once life became too busy for reflection. Now, I opened a fresh page and wrote a single sentence. I don't know who I'm becoming, but I think she's finally awake. The words startled me. Not because they were dramatic, but because they felt true. I kept writing. Small, unfinished thoughts. Fragments. No structure. Just pieces of what I had been carrying. At some point, the phone rang. I let it ring. It was him, my husband. I knew by the tone. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not yet. Not because I was angry. Not because I was trying to hurt him. But because I needed to sit with the silence a little longer. To figure out what part of me still belonged to that old life, and what part was no longer willing to go back. Later, I turned off the lights, leaving only the porch glowing. I stood by the window, watching it flicker gently in the wind. And I realized, with quiet certainty, that this wasn't just a pause. It was the beginning of something I couldn't take back. The weather shifted overnight. By morning, the skies were darker, heavy with low clouds that made the house feel smaller, as though the ceiling had dropped a few inches. Rain hadn't started yet, but I could smell it in the air, rich, mineral, full of memory. The kind of scent that brings both comfort and warning. I stood by the window in the kitchen, sipping my tea slowly, watching the wind brush the trees into motion. I hadn't returned my husband's call. There were a dozen reasons I could offer if he asked. Busy. Distracted. Forgot to charge my phone. But none of them would be true, and we were long past the stage of playing pretend. I wasn't avoiding the call because I was hiding something. I was avoiding it because I didn't know how to speak honestly without opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through. I spent most of the morning indoors. Reading, organizing drawers, wiping down the baseboards, chores that didn't require thinking. But by afternoon, the restlessness returned. I couldn't stay inside anymore. I needed to move, to breathe air that didn't taste like tension. So I grabbed my jacket, pulled on boots, and headed toward the park trail behind the neighborhood. It was narrow, less groomed than the town paths, with wild edges and mossy tree trunks. The kind of place where you could lose time without even trying. I hadn't planned to run into him there. But I wasn't surprised when I did. He was ahead of me, just past a curve in the trail, walking slowly with his hands in his pockets. He didn't hear my steps right away. When he finally turned and saw me, he stopped but didn't step aside. He waited. I almost turned back. But I didn't. We met in the middle of the path, the sounds of birds and distant wind wrapping around us. Didn't expect to see you, I said, my voice lower than usual. I didn't plan to be here, he replied. Just ended up walking. I nodded, looking down at the damp dirt path between us. I haven't answered his call, I admitted. He said nothing. Just kept watching me, like he was listening to something inside the silence. I don't know what to say, I continued. To either of you. You don't have to say anything today. That sentence settled in me like a blanket, soft, weighted. I didn't realize how badly I'd needed someone to say that. We walked side by side for a while, not touching, not speaking. Just moving in rhythm. The trees swayed above us, whispering through their leaves. The world around us had slowed, as if giving permission to breathe differently. Eventually, we reached a clearing where the path widened into a small overlook above the ravine. There was a bench, aged and cracked, but still strong. We sat without a word, both of us leaning forward, elbows on knees, gazing into the trees below. I've been thinking, he said after a long while, about how easy it is to lose someone without even realizing it. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because I knew exactly what he meant. He continued, slowly. Your husband's a good man. He's just living in a different room than you now. That image pierced something deep in me. A different room. Yes. That's what it felt like. Like we were both still in the same house, but with doors shut between us, too far apart to hear the knocks. Have you ever left a room like that? I asked. He hesitated. Once. A long time ago. I stayed too long. Then one day I turned around, and there was no door anymore. I exhaled slowly. I think mine is still there. But I don't know if I want to walk through it again. He didn't try to convince me. He didn't offer answers. He just sat with me in the truth of it. The clouds thickened, and a breeze rolled through, shaking the branches. I pulled my jacket tighter. We should head back, I said. He stood with a slight groan. Age and long walks had never been the best of friends. I smiled without thinking. The kind of smile that comes from habit, from history. The kind that lingers in the body longer than it does on the face. On the way back, we didn't talk. But our steps matched again. And that, somehow, was more comforting than conversation. When we reached the start of the path, he slowed. I'll take the long way, he said. You go ahead. I nodded. Part of me wanted to ask him to walk me home. Another part knew I needed to walk alone. At the porch, I paused before going inside. The herb garden had grown more than I'd expected. The basil was already reaching, the thyme clustering like tiny fists. Life was unfolding quietly, steadily, without permission or pause. I watered the soil gently, not because it needed it, but because I wanted to. The act grounded me, reminded me that even the most fragile things could root if given care. That evening, I cooked a real dinner for the first time in weeks. Roasted carrots, seasoned rice, a pan-seared piece of salmon. I set the table with 2 places, out of habit, then removed one. After eating, I sat on the couch with my notebook again. The page from the night before stared up at me, its single line now feeling both distant and prophetic. I wrote beneath it. I am not ready. But I am no longer afraid to become ready. I closed the notebook and let it rest on my lap. Outside, the wind picked up, and finally, the rain began to fall, soft at first, then steadier. I turned off the lights and stood by the window, watching it coat the porch in a quiet shimmer. I didn't know what would come next. But I knew I couldn't go back to who I had been before. And that, for now, was enough. The morning after the rain, everything outside looked freshly painted. Leaves glistened, sidewalks shimmered, and even the air felt scrubbed clean. I stood at the kitchen sink, my fingers curled around a warm mug, staring out the window at the herb garden. The basil had doubled in size. The thyme looked denser, stronger. I thought about trimming it, but I couldn't bring myself to touch anything just yet. I hadn't planned anything for the day. No errands, no lists, no excuses to leave the house. But a strange tension stirred in my chest, the kind that signals something is about to shift. I felt it in the way my shoulders carried themselves. In the stillness of the hallway. In the way my phone sat screen down on the table, as if it too was waiting. By mid-morning, the clouds had returned, not heavy like yesterday, but scattered, pale. I pulled open the hallway closet, searching for a small suitcase I hadn't used in years. It was tucked behind the winter coats, dusty but intact. I set it on the bed without really knowing why. Some part of me was preparing, though I couldn't yet say for what. I wandered the house again, my fingertips trailing along familiar furniture. These walls had held a version of me that I no longer recognized. A woman who accepted silence as comfort. Who confused absence for independence. Who waited too long to speak. By early afternoon, the restlessness grew. I found myself dialing his number, not my husband's, but his father's. My hands moved without resistance, my thumb hovering a moment before pressing call. It rang once, twice. Then his voice, steady as ever, answered. Hello? I need to talk, I said. Can you come? I'm already outside, he said quietly. I turned toward the window. His car was parked just down the street. I hadn't even noticed. He must have arrived minutes ago. Maybe he'd been sitting there, unsure, just like I had been. I opened the front door before he reached the steps. He walked up slowly, a cautious energy in his movement, as though unsure whether he was invited into a conversation or a confrontation. Inside, I motioned to the kitchen table. We sat across from each other, the same table where we once drank wine and pretended everything was fine. Today, we didn't pretend. I can't undo what's happened, I began, voice low, steady. And I'm not going to rewrite it to make it cleaner. He nodded, his hands resting flat on the table, calm, still. It's not just about a moment, I continued. It's not about a kiss, or the things we don't say aloud. It's about what we've both allowed ourselves to feel. His eyes didn't leave mine. I know. I don't want to hide, I said. But I also don't want to destroy. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the distant hum of the refrigerator. The kind of silence that weighs heavy, not because it's empty, but because it's full of things unsaid. He looked down at his hands. I've asked myself 100 times if I should have stopped this earlier. If I should have walked away that day on the porch. You didn't. No, he said. Because I didn't want to. That confession, simple and direct, hit harder than I expected. I feel split in two, I whispered. Like I'm standing between a door that's still open and a window that just let in air I didn't know I needed. He reached for his glass of water, took a sip, and set it down carefully. Then don't choose today. Just exist in the doorway for a while. It sounded simple. But it wasn't. We sat in that space, neither past nor future, for what felt like hours. And then my phone buzzed. It was a message from my husband. Boarding soon. Can't wait to see you. 7 words. Innocent. Familiar. But in the space they took up on the screen, I felt my breath catch. He was coming home. I turned the phone over and placed it face down again. I need space, I said to him. Not just from you. From everything. He didn't flinch. I understand. I mean it, I said. I can't see you. Not until I know what part of this is real and what part is just me trying to feel something. I'll wait, he said simply. That night, I made up the guest room. I washed the sheets, opened the window, let the cool evening air cleanse the stale corners. I wasn't expecting anyone to use it. But I needed the room to be ready. Not for him. Not for my husband. For me. In case I needed to sleep away from my own reflection. Dinner was quiet. I roasted vegetables again, baked a small piece of salmon, sipped water instead of wine. I ate slowly, tasting everything with new attention. Afterwards, I went outside and sat on the steps of the porch. The sky was full of faint stars, dim behind the drifting clouds. I pulled my knees to my chest and rested my chin on them, listening to the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere down the street. I thought about what I'd say to my husband when he arrived. Whether I'd hug him. Whether I'd let him unpack. Whether I'd look him in the eye and tell the truth. Maybe I would. Maybe not right away. But soon. And then, quietly, I remembered the bench under the jacaranda tree. The moment I asked him for space, and the way he'd honored it without resentment. That, more than anything else, stayed with me. Before going inside, I walked around the back to check on the herbs again. The soil was still moist from the rain. I ran my hand gently over the rosemary, the scent rising warm and earthy. I closed my eyes for a moment. And I whispered, not to anyone, not even to myself, but to the night. I'm not who I was. And I don't yet know who I'm becoming. But for now, it was enough just to admit that I was changing. He arrived 2 hours earlier than expected. The suitcase hit the floor with a soft thump, and I heard the familiar shuffle of shoes being removed by the door. I was in the kitchen, slicing cucumbers with a slow, deliberate rhythm. My heart skipped, not from joy or fear, but from the sudden realization that I was no longer sure what his return meant. "Hey," he said, his voice echoing lightly in the quiet house. I turned. He looked tired, travel-worn. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, collar loose, dark circles just faint enough under his eyes. He smiled, out of habit more than emotion. I nodded in return, not stepping forward. "You got in early," I said. "Yeah, flight was ahead of schedule." He walked toward me and leaned in for a kiss, but I turned my cheek. I felt him hesitate, then pull back without comment. He set his backpack on the chair, glanced around. "Place looks nice," he said, walking over to the counter. "Smells like mint in here." "I've been growing herbs," I replied, still slicing. He watched me for a few seconds, then opened the fridge, pulled out a bottle of water, and leaned against the island counter. I didn't ask about his trip. He didn't offer to tell me. We ate dinner without music, the sound of forks against plates punctuating the quiet. He asked small questions, how the neighborhood was, whether the electricity had gone out during the storm, but they floated in the air, detached, like placeholders for conversations we were too tired to have. After dinner, he offered to do the dishes, and I let him. I went upstairs, not because I was avoiding him, but because I needed to sit somewhere that wasn't filled with everything we used to be. In the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the half-packed suitcase I'd left there earlier. I hadn't intended for him to see it. I wasn't even sure why I'd pulled it out in the first place. But now, it felt like a truth I couldn't hide. I zipped it up, slid it back into the closet, and closed the door. He came up about 15 minutes later, wiping his hands on a towel, a tight expression on his face. "You've been distant lately," he said. Not accusatory. Just stating a fact. "I know. Did something happen?" I didn't answer right away. I could feel the moment swell, like standing on a cracked sheet of ice, knowing that the next step could break everything. "Yes," I said finally. He blinked once. "Do I want to know?" "I don't know," I whispered. "I don't know what will help anymore." He sat on the chair near the window. "I didn't think we were broken." "We're not," I said. "But we're not whole either." He nodded slowly. "Was it someone else?" The question hung there, suspended between us. I didn't answer. I didn't lie. I simply looked down at my hands, which were resting motionless in my lap. "I see," he said after a long pause. There was no anger in his voice. Just a kind of tiredness I hadn't heard before. A resignation that made me ache in ways I hadn't anticipated. "I'm not proud of how I've been," he said. "I thought if I worked harder, if I provided, that was enough." "It was never about that," I said. I needed to feel like I still mattered. Not just functionally. Emotionally. "I thought we were fine," he said, voice low. "You didn't say anything." "I did," I said. "You didn't hear me." Another silence. This one more strained than the others. He rubbed his temples. "Is it over?" "I don't know." He didn't ask who. He didn't ask when. And I didn't offer. Later that night, he slept in the guest room. I didn't ask him to. He didn't ask if he could. He just took a pillow, quietly gathered a blanket, and disappeared down the hall. I sat on our bed, wrapped in my robe, staring at the dim hallway light bleeding under the door. It felt unreal. But not dramatic. Not explosive. Just inevitable. In the morning, he was already gone when I came downstairs. A note sat on the kitchen counter, went for a walk. Will be back later. I made coffee, sat at the table, and stared out the window. The wind had picked up. The trees leaned slightly with each gust. I remembered a time when we used to watch storms together, wrapped in one blanket, legs tangled. I couldn't remember the last time that had happened. By midday, I received a text. It wasn't from my husband. It was from him. Just checking in. Hope you're all right. I stared at it for a long time before typing back. I'm not. But I'm trying to be. A few moments later, his reply came. That's enough. I'll be here. The honesty of it made my throat tighten. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That evening, my husband returned, quieter than usual. He poured himself a drink and stood by the window while I prepared something light for dinner. Neither of us spoke. The house, though clean and orderly, felt cluttered with everything we hadn't said. Later, as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, he finally broke the silence. I'm not sure where we go from here. I nodded. Neither am I. But we were here. In the same room. Not shouting. Not accusing. Just trying to find a thread in the unraveling fabric. And for now, that was the only truth we could hold. The house had taken on a new kind of quiet. It wasn't the lonely silence of absence, nor the peaceful hush of solitude, it was the charged, complicated stillness of two people coexisting in the same space, but no longer moving toward each other. My husband and I were like two lines drawn side by side. Parallel. Close. But never intersecting. He had taken up residence in the guest room. We didn't talk about it. It wasn't a decision made aloud, but it lingered in the air between us every time we passed each other in the hallway or reached for the same drawer in the kitchen. There was no hostility. No raised voices. Just the constant, low thrum of unspoken truths humming beneath everything. In the mornings, we shared the same kitchen. He made coffee. I made tea. We moved carefully, quietly, like roommates who had known each other too long and knew all the ways to avoid friction. He still asked about errands, left notes reminding me about appointments, sent texts if he was going to be late. But none of it reached below the surface. It was all courtesy, not connection. I began walking more. Long stretches through the neighborhood and beyond, sometimes not realizing how far I'd gone until my legs ached. I found myself at the library one afternoon, wandering the aisles without intention, letting the smell of old paper and quiet hush settle me. I checked out a novel I probably wouldn't finish, just to feel the weight of something borrowed in my hands. It was during one of these walks that I ended up near his street again. I didn't mean to. At least, that's what I told myself. But my feet slowed as I approached, my gaze pulling toward the porch where he sometimes sat in the late afternoons. He was there. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. But he stood slowly and met me halfway down the path, as if he'd been expecting this moment without knowing when it would come. I wasn't sure I should stop, I said. You didn't have to. I know. We stood in silence, the sounds of distant lawnmowers and wind chimes filling the gaps. He gestured toward the side of the house. I've been trimming back the hedges, he said. They were overgrown. I nodded, following him without question. The backyard was modest, clean, simple, with a few worn chairs and an old watering can leaning against the fence. The air smelled like cut grass and soil. We sat beneath the shade of a maple tree, the sun filtering in patches through the leaves. "How is he?" he asked. I exhaled slowly. "Present. But far." He looked down, his hands folded in front of him. "And you?" he asked. "Fragmented," I said. "Some days, I wake up and feel whole again. Other days, I feel like I'm walking through my life wearing someone else's skin." He didn't respond immediately. Just nodded, like he understood. "I told him something happened," I added. "Not the details. But enough." He looked at me then, his expression unreadable. "And?" He didn't ask who. He didn't want to know. The breeze picked up, tugging gently at the edges of his sleeves. "I've thought about that night," he said, voice low. "What we allowed to happen. What it meant. I've thought of nothing else." He looked at me for a long time before speaking again. "Do you regret it?" I turned my face toward the wind. "No. But I wish it hadn't happened the way it did. I wish I had been clearer with myself first." He nodded. "We can't rewrite it." "No," I said. "But we can decide what comes next." He didn't answer. The unspoken question hung between us: were we willing to go further? Or had the moment passed? "I should go," I said, standing slowly. He stood too, hands at his sides. "You'll let me know if you need anything?" "I always do," I said. I walked home without looking back. That evening, my husband was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables. The radio played something soft and forgettable. He didn't ask where I'd been. I didn't offer. During dinner, he looked up at me and said, "Do you want to try?" I blinked. "Try what?" "Us." Again. The question was simple, but it came with the weight of everything we had been avoiding. "I don't know if trying is enough," I said. He nodded. "Then what would be?" "I think we have to be honest. Brutally honest. Even if it hurts." He set down his fork. "Then let's start." I swallowed hard. "I haven't loved you the same way in a long time." His face didn't change. He just looked at me, waiting. "I've missed being seen. Being touched. Not just physically, but emotionally. I've felt invisible for years." "I didn't mean to make you feel that way," he said. "I know," I said. "But you did." He leaned back in his chair. "So what do we do?" I looked at him for a long time. "We tell the truth. Even if it unravels us." He nodded. And for the first time in a long while, I saw something shift in his face. Not understanding, exactly. But acknowledgement. As if he'd finally opened the door to the room we had both been living outside of. That night, we didn't sleep in the same bed. But we didn't close our doors, either. Time passed differently after that night, not in big leaps or dramatic turns, but in a slow, deliberate unfolding, like watching leaves drift down from a tree in late autumn. My husband and I moved carefully around each other, but something in the air had changed. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. And it wasn't reconciliation. But it was the beginning of something that looked a little like honesty. We talked more, truly talked, not just exchanging information or reminders. Our conversations became confessions, small truths offered up like tokens. I told him about the loneliness that had taken root in our marriage, the ways I had felt unseen, untouched, unneeded. He told me about his fear of disappointing me, about the pressure he felt to be enough, to provide, to keep everything afloat even when he felt himself sinking. There were tears, but they were quiet, and for the first time in years, I let myself be seen with all my flaws and weaknesses. Some days were harder than others. There were mornings when I woke and found him already gone, a note on the counter saying he'd be back later. Sometimes I wanted to chase him, to force a resolution, but mostly I just let the space exist between us, letting each of us breathe in our own way. The guest room remained his, though sometimes I caught him standing in the doorway of our old bedroom, as if considering a return. But he never crossed the threshold. The days blurred together in a rhythm of cautious hope. I took long walks, as I had before, but I noticed things more sharply, the way the sunlight angled through the trees, the crispness of the air as summer gave way to fall. I spent more time in the garden, tending to the herbs, letting the dirt work its way under my fingernails, grounding myself in something simple and alive. It was easier to be present among living things that asked nothing of me but care. One afternoon, as I watered the thyme, I heard footsteps on the gravel behind the fence. I glanced up. It was him. He didn't come to the gate, he simply stood there, hands in his pockets, waiting for me to look up. I finished watering, set down the can, and walked over. We stood on opposite sides of the fence, the boards between us. He smiled, a tired, real smile, and for a moment, I felt the familiar ache of everything unspoken. "How are you?" he asked. "I'm figuring things out," I said. "One day at a time." He nodded. "I thought I should check on you." "I appreciate it." We stood in silence, the late afternoon sun making patterns on the wood. "I'm leaving town for a while," he said finally. "Visiting my brother upstate. I thought you should know." I felt the words land somewhere deep inside me. "Will you come back?" "I don't know," he said. "Maybe. If you want me to." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked at the garden, the herbs pushing upward, stubborn and green. "I need time," I said. He smiled again, softer this time. "You have it. As much as you need." He turned and walked away, his steps slow and even. I watched until he disappeared down the street, swallowed by the shade of the trees. That night, the house felt emptier than usual. My husband was home, but the silence was different, less like absence, more like potential. We sat together on the porch, watching the sky turn violet and then dark. "Do you think we can find our way back?" he asked quietly. I thought about the path that had led us here, all the mistakes, the betrayals, the moments of kindness and neglect. I thought about the man walking away from me down the street, and the man sitting beside me now. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I think I want to try." He reached for my hand, not forcefully, but with gentle uncertainty. I let him take it. We sat there until the porch lights came on, hands entwined, breathing in the newness of what might come. When the house grew cold, we went inside. He paused at the threshold of our old bedroom, then turned and kissed my cheek. "Good night," he said. "Good night," I replied. He walked down the hall to the guest room, and I listened to the quiet click of the door. I stood there for a while, letting the darkness settle. I didn't know what would happen next, or how long this fragile truce would hold. But for the first time in a long time, I felt the pulse of possibility, faint, but real, like green shoots breaking through thawed earth. And I realized that, whatever came next, I would meet it as I was now, changed, uncertain, but awake.